My disabled husband refused to let me eat, and the truth came too late. But nothing in my life prepared me for the moment my own family turned a simple dinner into something I would never forget. "Emily, just sit down and stop acting paranoid," Olivia said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just food," my mother-in-law added softly, as if that made everything safe. My sister Olivia had cooked dinner for me and my disabled husband in her perfect Virginia home, the kind of place that always looked too clean to feel real, and just before I took my first bite, my husband Ethan suddenly shouted, "Don't eat that!" His voice cut through the room like glass breaking under pressure, and every fork froze mid-air. Then he did something I never expected. He pushed his wheelchair slightly forward, his hands shaking, and pointed at the plate like it was dangerous. "You don't understand what that is," he said, and for a second nobody spoke. Minutes later, my hands wouldn't stop trembling, not because of fear alone, but because something in that room suddenly felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. And as I looked around the table, I realized no one else seemed ready to admit it either. If this story speaks to your heart, or if you believe family truth should never be hidden behind a smile, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more stories like this reach people who need them, and I would also love to know where you are watching from, your city or country, and what time it is there right now as you hear this story, because somehow these moments feel less lonely when we share them together. And now let me take you into the night everything changed, and I am Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and I always thought I understood my family until that evening in Richmond, Virginia, when everything I believed about trust began to fall apart. And if there is one thing I learned that night, it is that silence in a family is never empty. It is always hiding something, and that night started like any other American family dinner. The kind you see in suburbs where the lawns are cut too neatly, and the houses look calm even when people inside are not. Olivia had insisted on cooking. She always did that when she wanted to appear like the one holding everything together. My husband Ethan sat in his wheelchair near the end of the dining table, quiet, observant, his eyes moving between every plate like he was reading something no one else could see. Ethan used to serve in the military, and after his injury he became quieter, not weaker, just different. More alert in ways people often misunderstood. And my mother-in-law Margaret kept saying how lucky we were to have Olivia helping us, as if I wasn't sitting right there. I remember the first small crack in that evening came not from Ethan but from Olivia, when she placed a bowl in front of me and said softly, "I made it special for you, Em, just like old times." And something in her voice made me pause longer than I should have, because there was a kind of control hidden behind her kindness, a kind that only shows itself when no one is looking closely enough. I looked at Ethan, and he didn't touch his fork, not yet, just watching, and then I remember Olivia laughing lightly, telling a story about how families sometimes overthink simple things, and my father-in-law Robert nodded along as if everything was normal, but Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, almost invisible unless you knew him, and I did, or I thought I did. I remember asking him quietly, "Are you okay?" And he answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "Just don't eat until I say so." And I thought he was being paranoid again. The kind of concern people dismiss because they don't want to deal with it, but then came the moment everything split open. I lifted my fork, just inches from the plate, and Olivia was still talking, still smiling, still performing her perfect role in the family, when Ethan suddenly slammed his hand against the armrest of his wheelchair and shouted, "Don't eat that!" And the sound of his voice changed everything in the room instantly. Margaret gasped. Robert's eyes narrowed. Olivia froze mid-sentence, and I remember the exact feeling in my chest, like the air had been taken out of the room without warning. Ethan was breathing harder now, pointing at the food, his voice lower but sharper. "Emily, I'm not guessing. I'm telling you, don't eat it." Olivia immediately stood up, pushing her chair back, laughing nervously. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. I cooked everything myself." But Ethan didn't look at her. He looked at me. And that is what scared me more than anything, because his eyes weren't angry, they were certain, and certainty like that doesn't come from emotion, it comes from knowledge. I remember Margaret whispering, "Maybe he's having one of his episodes." And Robert saying nothing at all, just watching me, waiting, as if my reaction would decide which version of reality they would accept. And in that moment I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, but confusion so deep it made my hands go cold. I lowered the fork slowly back to the plate, And Ethan leaned forward slightly and said, "I know what she put in it." And that was the first time Olivia's smile disappeared completely, just for a second, but long enough for me to see something underneath it, something I had never seen before. And before anyone could speak again, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, and when he looked at it, his face changed in a way I will never forget, because whatever he saw on that screen wasn't just surprising, it was confirming. And that was the exact moment I realized this dinner was not what I thought it was, and someone in this room had been waiting for this moment far longer than I ever knew. But what I didn't understand yet was why my own sister was suddenly looking at me, like I was the one who had done something wrong. After Ethan's warning shattered the room, I remember how silence can feel heavier than sound, how it can press against your skin until you are no longer sure whether you are breathing or just surviving the moment. Olivia was the first to move again, not because she was calm, but because she needed control back. She let out a soft laugh, the kind people use when they want to make fear look like a misunderstanding. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, smoothing her hands over the edge of the table. "I cooked a simple dinner, that is all." But Ethan did not look at her. He kept his eyes on me, steady, unblinking, as if he was waiting for me to finally see what he had already seen. And that was when something inside me shifted. Not trust, not fear, but memory, because this was not the first time I had felt like the truth in my own family was something I was always the last to understand. I remember being 10 years old in a small house just outside Richmond, Virginia, sitting at a kitchen table with a broken corner that my father always promised he would fix, but never did. Olivia sat across from me even then. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect answers. And I remember holding a drawing I had made in school, a simple family picture with all of us together. I was proud of it. I thought it meant something. But my mother looked at Olivia's report card instead and said softly, "Your sister is doing so well this year." And no one asked about my drawing, not even once. I remember asking my father later that night, "Did you see it?" And he did not even look up from his newspaper when he said, "I am busy, Emily." And those two words, so simple, somehow stayed with me longer than anything else in that house. Years passed like that, not in explosions but in small erasures. Birthdays where Olivia's achievements were celebrated at restaurants while my presence was assumed. School events where my name was called last, or not at all. Conversations where I spoke, and no one answered for a moment too long. Until I learned that silence was not absence, it was placement. I was simply placed lower, always lower. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 16. Olivia arrived late and still received the seat closest to my mother, that which is 10 ended, while I sat near the end of the table beside the kitchen door, where people passed without noticing me, and when I tried to speak about a scholarship I had earned, my father nodded once and said, "That is nice, Emily," then turned back to Olivia to ask about her plans for summer. It was not cruelty in loud forms, it was something quieter, something that trained you to doubt your own importance, and I learned to smile through it, to adjust, to shrink my voice just enough to avoid correction. And then came Ethan. Years later, when I thought I had finally escaped that pattern, he was not part of my family at first, just a quiet man with a steady presence, someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who noticed things I had stopped expecting anyone to notice. I remember him saying once, "You apologized too quickly." And I laughed because I thought it was a joke, but he was not joking. Even then he saw the way I hesitated before speaking, the way I checked faces before finishing sentences. And when we married, I believed I was starting a new chapter, but I did not yet understand that family patterns do not end. Just because you move them into a different house, they follow you in quieter ways. Olivia became more present after that, always helpful, always offering to cook, to visit, to organize things, and my parents began calling her more often than me, asking her opinions on things I was never asked about. I remember Ethan once asking me, "Does it bother you?" And I said no too quickly because admitting it would have meant admitting it had always been there, and I was tired of admitting things that never changed anything. Now sitting at that table in Richmond, Virginia, I could feel all of that history folding back into the present moment. Ethan still watching me, Olivia still performing calm, my parents-in-law exchanging looks they thought I would not notice, and me realizing that the unease I felt was not new at all. It was familiar. It was older than this dinner, older than this house. It was the same feeling I had carried since childhood, the feeling that something important was happening just out of my reach. And I was always the last to be told. Ethan finally leaned slightly closer to me and said quietly, "I did not want to say anything in front of them before I was sure." And Olivia immediately interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Sure of what exactly?" But Ethan still did not look at her. He reached into the pocket beside his wheelchair and pulled out a small folded paper, placing it carefully on the table without unfolding it yet. And in that moment I noticed something strange in Olivia's expression. Not anger, not confusion, but recognition, like she had already seen that paper before, or had been afraid of it appearing. And I realized then that whatever was happening at this table was not beginning tonight. It had been building for years, quietly, patiently, around me, and I was only now being allowed to see the outline of it, just enough to understand that nothing in my life with my sister had ever been as simple as I was told. And Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low but steady. "Emily, I need you to remember something from 10 years ago, something you were never supposed to think about again." And when he said that, I felt my stomach tighten, because there was only one moment from 10 years ago that my family had always insisted did not matter anymore, but judging by the way Olivia's hands suddenly stopped moving, I was beginning to think it mattered more than anyone had ever admitted. The moment Ethan placed that folded paper on the table, the entire room felt like it had shifted its gravity, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made every small sound suddenly feel too clear. Olivia stared at it for half a second too long before forcing a soft laugh, the kind people use when they want to buy time. "Ethan, whatever this is, you are making a scene," she said, smoothing her dress as if control could be restored through fabric alone. But Ethan did not respond to her. He only looked at me, and that silence between us felt heavier than anything said out loud. My fingers were still slightly numb from the shock earlier, yet something in me was now awake in a way I did not understand. Olivia leaned forward and reached for the paper, but Ethan stopped her with a simple movement of his hand, not aggressive, not fast, just final. "Do not touch it until she sees it," he said quietly, and for the first time that night, Olivia's expression cracked, just slightly, like a glass surface under pressure. She turned to me immediately, her voice sharper now. "Emily, tell your husband to stop this, whatever game he is playing." But I did not answer right away, because in that moment I felt something deeper than confusion. I felt recognition, like my body remembered something my mind had tried to forget for years, and Ethan's words from earlier came back to me, something from 10 years ago, something I was never supposed to think about again. Olivia exhaled sharply and stood up from the table, walking a few steps as if distance could reset the situation. "This is insane," she said, looking at my parents. "In-law now. I came here to help. I cooked dinner, I did everything right, and now I am being treated like this." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Robert avoided eye contact completely, and I realized something strange. Olivia was not just angry, she was afraid of losing control of the narrative. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice steady but lower. "You always thought no one would question you because you were the responsible one," he said, and Olivia snapped back instantly. "And you always thought you were smarter than everyone because you wore a uniform?" Ethan did not react to the insult. He simply nodded slightly, as if confirming something he had already accepted long ago. Then he turned his eyes to me again and said, "Emily, 10 years ago, after your grandmother passed, there were documents, financial transfers, things that were never fully explained to you." My stomach tightened immediately at the mention of my grandmother, because that was a time my family had always described as painful but settled, nothing more. Olivia interrupted quickly, her voice rising now. "Do not bring that up, that is not relevant." But Ethan continued anyway, slowly unfolding the paper, revealing bank statements and printed records that looked ordinary at first glance. But his finger traced one line that made the air feel different. "This account," he said quietly, "was opened 3 days after she died." Olivia laughed again, but it was weaker now. "So what? Families manage estates all the time," she said. But Ethan finally looked directly at her, and what he said next made her stop breathing for a second. "Not in your name, Olivia, and not with Emily's signature." The room went silent again, but this time it was different. It was not confusion anymore. It was realization slowly forming like cracks spreading through glass. I felt my pulse in my fingertips as I looked at the document myself now, my eyes scanning names, dates, signatures that looked familiar but did not belong together. And for the first time I understood why Ethan had been watching everything so carefully tonight. Olivia's voice dropped lower, losing its earlier confidence. "You do not understand what you are looking at," she said, but Ethan replied immediately, "I understand enough to know this was never just about dinner." Robert finally spoke then, his voice uncertain. "Olivia, what is he talking about?" And that question alone seemed to shake her more than anything else, because it forced her to turn away from control and into explanation, something she clearly was not ready for. I looked at her face then, really looked, and I saw something I had never allowed myself to see before. Not anger, not pride, but desperation, hiding under carefully built certainty, and Ethan's voice lowered as he added one final line that changed everything in the room. "You did not just cook this meal, you set the table for something that started 10 years ago." And in that exact moment, I realized that whatever truth was buried in that paper, it was not just about money or signatures or even family conflict. It was about something much deeper, something that had been quietly shaping my entire life without my permission. And Olivia, for the first time since I had known her, did not have a response ready, only silence and a look that told me she finally understood the direction this night was going, even if I did not yet understand where it would end. The silence in the room had changed shape. It was no longer confusion. It had become something heavier, something waiting, like the moment before a storm decides where to break. Olivia was still standing near the edge of the dining table, her hands slightly trembling now, but her voice still trying to hold authority. "You are all acting like this makes sense when it does not," she said, but even she did not sound convinced anymore. Robert was still staring at the documents on the table, his brow tightening as if he was trying to force the world to rearrange itself into something familiar again. Margaret whispered something under her breath that I could not fully hear, and Ethan remained still, not victorious, not emotional, just present, like a man who had already carried this weight for too long to be surprised by it anymore. And then the doorbell rang, a sharp sound that cut through the tension like it did not belong to this moment at all. No one moved at first, because in a room like that, even a doorbell feels like a decision. Then Margaret slowly turned her head toward the hallway and said quietly, "I am not expecting anyone." And that was when Olivia's expression changed again. Not relief, not fear, but recognition. Like she suddenly understood something about timing that the rest of us did not. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the hallway as well, and for the first time since this night began, he looked uncertain. Not afraid, just alert in a different way, like a man hearing footsteps he had once known very well. Robert stood up slowly and said, "I will get it." But before he could take a step, the front door opened anyway, because whoever was outside had already let themselves in. There was no urgency in the footsteps that followed, only certainty, and when the man appeared in the dining room entrance, everything in the room adjusted around him without permission. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a dark coat that still carried the structure of someone used to formal environments, his posture straight in a way that did not match his age, his eyes scanning the room once before landing on Ethan. And then something subtle happened. His entire expression shifted, not shock, not confusion, but recognition so immediate it felt like the air changed temperature. "Ethan Marshall," the man said quietly, and Ethan froze in a way I had never seen before, not physically restrained, but mentally caught, like a door inside him had just been opened without warning. Olivia turned toward the man immediately, her voice sharpening again. "Who are you? This is a private family matter." But the man did not look at her at all. He kept his eyes on Ethan. And then he said something that made the room feel smaller. "I thought you were dead or lost to the system. They never told me you were here." Margaret stepped back slightly from the table. Robert frowned, and I felt my chest tighten because I realized I was no longer just watching a family argument. I was watching something else entirely. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "Sir," he said, and that single word told me everything I needed to know. This was not just a stranger. This was history. The man stepped further into the room now, and I noticed the way he looked at the documents on the table, not as evidence of conflict, but as confirmation of something already known. "I am not here by accident," he said calmly. "I was called when certain financial irregularities connected to military-linked survivor accounts were flagged." Olivia let out a short laugh again, but it had no strength left in it. "Military survivor accounts. What are you talking about?" she said. but the man finally looked at her directly now, and his gaze alone made her stop speaking for a moment. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I am Colonel Richard Halston, retired Judge Advocate General Corps." The words landed in the room like a weight no one was prepared to hold. Even Robert straightened slightly at the title because in families like this, titles still meant something, but what mattered more was what came next. The colonel turned slightly toward Ethan again and said, "You were not supposed to be in a position where your family could access those accounts without oversight, yet here we are." Ethan exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding his breath for years rather than minutes, and for the first time, I saw something break in his composure, not collapse but release. Olivia stepped forward now, her voice rising again. "This is insane. You are all making assumptions based on paperwork you do not understand." But Colonel Halston did not respond to her defensively. He simply placed a folder of his own on the table, opening it carefully. And what I saw inside was not dramatic, not emotional, just official, structured, and devastating in its simplicity. "I reviewed the chain of custody for these documents 3 days ago," he said, "and I can confirm that there are signatures here that should not exist, and access logs that indicate manipulation of estate control after death authorization." The word manipulation made Olivia stop moving entirely, and for the first time she looked at me, not as an obstacle, not as a problem, but as if she was trying to calculate how much I actually knew. Ethan finally leaned back slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "I told you this was not just about dinner," and in that moment I understood something I had not understood before. This was not a misunderstanding that escalated. This was a structure that had been built carefully over time, and we had all been placed inside it without knowing. Colonel Halston looked at me now, and his expression softened slightly. "You must be Emily Carter," he said, and when I nodded he added something that made my stomach tighten. "I knew your grandmother. She made sure certain protections were written into place before she passed. Protections I believe someone has tried very hard to bypass." Olivia's face went pale in a way that was no longer controlled, and Robert finally spoke again, his voice uncertain. "What exactly are you saying?" And the colonel replied without hesitation, "I am saying this family may have inherited more than they were told, and someone here has been operating under information that was never fully disclosed to all beneficiaries." The room did not move after that. It simply held still, like it was waiting for one final truth to decide what it would become. And Ethan slowly turned his head toward Olivia and said quietly, "You were never supposed to be the only one with access." And that was when I realized this night was no longer about what was in front of us. It was about everything that had been hidden long before any of us sat down at this table. The room did not move after Colonel Halston finished speaking. It simply existed in a suspended state, as if even the walls were trying to decide what kind of truth they were now holding. Olivia stood near the dining table without sitting down again, her hands now resting tightly on the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Robert had not spoken in several minutes, and Margaret kept looking between Ethan and the colonel, as if trying to find a version of reality that still made sense. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, slow and heavy, not from fear exactly, but from the strange sensation that something underneath my entire life had just started to shift. Colonel Halston opened the folder again, this time not as a warning, but as explanation, and his voice softened slightly when he spoke. "Emily Carter, there are things your grandmother ensured would not be easily accessible, unless specific conditions were met," he said, and I realized everyone in the room had turned slightly toward me without meaning to, as if I had suddenly become the center of something I never asked to be part of. Ethan remained still, but his eyes flicked toward me briefly, not to explain, but to confirm that I was ready for what came next, and I nodded without fully understanding why. Olivia let out a short breath, almost like frustration mixed with disbelief. "This is ridiculous. You are all acting like she is some kind of key to all of this," she said, and Colonel Halston did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned a single page in the folder and said calmly, "Not a key, ma'am. A beneficiary, but not in the way you are assuming." The words landed carefully, slowly, like they had been chosen to avoid breaking something too quickly, and I felt my mind trying to catch up before my emotions could react. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Emily, your grandmother did not trust that everything would remain equal after she passed, and I felt a strange tightness in my chest at hearing that, because no one in my family had ever spoken about her like that before. not like she anticipated anything beyond her own lifetime. Robert frowned slightly and said, "That does not make sense. Everything was settled years ago." But the colonel immediately replied, "On record, yes, but not in structure." And he slid a single document across the table toward me. I hesitated before touching it, my fingers slightly cold, and when I finally pulled it closer, I saw my grandmother's name at the top, not as a memory but as an authority. A trust directive with layers of conditions I had never been told existed. Olivia moved closer now, her voice lower but sharper. "Emily, do not just sit there and listen to this. This is exactly how misunderstandings start." But for the first time, I did not immediately respond to her, because something about the paper in front of me felt too precise to be a misunderstanding. Ethan leaned slightly forward and said, "Read the clause about secondary authorization." And I did, slowly, line by line, and what I saw made my breath stop for a moment, because it stated that certain financial and medical-linked decisions tied to my grandmother's estate could not be accessed or altered without dual family consent, one of which required my acknowledgement as primary family descendant. I looked up at Ethan without speaking, and he gave me a very small nod, not of victory, but of confirmation that I was finally seeing what he had been trying to point toward all night. Olivia shook her head quickly. "That is not possible. I handled everything after she passed. I made sure everything was organized," and that was the first time her voice carried something unstable underneath it. Not anger anymore, but pressure, like something she had been holding together for a long time was starting to loosen. Colonel Halston closed the folder slightly and said, "Organization and authorization are not the same thing," and then he looked at me directly again. "Emily, your grandmother left specific safeguards because she believed there was a risk of internal consolidation of control within the family structure." The words sounded almost too formal for something so personal, but they carried weight that none of us could ignore. Robert finally stepped forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "Emily, did you know any of this?" And I shook my head slowly, because the truth was I did not even a fragment of it, and that realization felt heavier than anything else in the room. Olivia suddenly laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "So what now? We are supposed to believe there is some hidden system that makes her more important than the rest of us," she said. And Ethan finally turned his head toward her, his voice steady but different now. "It is not about importance, it is about access." And for a moment no one spoke, because that word changed the shape of everything we thought we understood. Access meant control. Access meant decisions. Access meant that something had been happening without full visibility for years. I looked down again at the document, at my grandmother's signature, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not fear, not anger, but distance. Like I was suddenly seeing my own family from outside of it for the first time. Colonel Halston gently tapped the edge of the paper and said, "But it requires your formal acknowledgement to proceed further." And all eyes in the room shifted toward me again, not aggressively, but with expectation, and I realized in that moment that whatever truth was hidden behind all of this, it had been waiting for me specifically, not Olivia, not Robert, not even Ethan. And Olivia, for the first time since this night began, did not interrupt. She only watched me, very quietly, as if she was suddenly unsure whether she was still in control of the story she had spent years helping to write. The room did not feel the same anymore after I spoke the words that had been sitting inside me like something unfinished for years. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I did not accuse anyone. I simply read what was in front of me again, slowly, carefully, as if saying it clearly enough would finally make it real for everyone else in the room. This document states that access to the estate allocation and medical-linked trust decisions requires dual authorization, I said, and my voice surprised even me because it sounded steady, almost detached, like I was describing something that belonged to someone else's life, not mine. Olivia immediately shook her head, stepping forward, her hands slightly raised, as if trying to push the moment away. "That is not what it means, Emily. You are misunderstanding legal language," she said quickly. But for the first time, there was something thin in her voice, something strained. Robert looked at her now instead of the paper, and Margaret was completely silent, her eyes moving between all of us as if she was watching a structure she had trusted for years beginning to shift. Ethan did not speak, he simply watched me, not correcting, not guiding, just letting me continue. And I realized then that this was the first time in a long time that no one was interrupting my voice. Colonel Halston stepped slightly forward, calm in a way that made the tension in the room feel even sharper. The language is standard for protected estate layering when concerns of unilateral access exist, he said, and Olivia turned toward him immediately, her composure cracking just slightly. There were no concerns. Everything was handled properly. I handled everything, she said. And now the repetition of her own words sounded less like confidence and more like defense. I looked down at the document again, and I could feel something inside me slowing down instead of speeding up, like my body was refusing panic and choosing clarity instead. I said softly, "I did not sign anything after my grandmother passed. I was not even informed these structures existed." And as I said it, I watched Olivia's reaction change, not instantly, but in stages, first denial, then irritation, then something close to panic trying to hide itself behind control. "That is not true, you were informed. You must have been," she said, turning slightly toward Robert as if needing backup, but Robert did not respond immediately, and that silence was louder than anything else in the room. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower now. "Emily, look at the amendment date." And I did, and what I saw was simple but undeniable. The amendment had been filed and activated after my grandmother's passing, but within a narrow window that required legal notification to all listed beneficiaries, including me. I lifted my eyes slowly, and I said, "I was never contacted. No emotion, no accusation, just fact." And that was when the shift in the room became irreversible. Olivia's breath became sharper, her posture tighter, and she finally stopped looking at the document and looked directly at me. "This is ridiculous. You are all trying to turn this into something it is not," she said. But her voice no longer carried authority, only pressure. Ethan leaned forward slightly, still calm, still grounded, and said, "Then explain the access logs." Olivia froze for a fraction of a second, and that fraction was enough. Colonel Halston opened a second page in his folder and placed it on the table, his tone unchanged. "There are recorded instances of financial access requests originating under secondary authorization credentials that do not match Emily's confirmed consent," he said, and then added quietly, "which requires explanation." Olivia suddenly let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief mixed with anger. "You are accusing me of something based on technical paperwork you do not understand," she said, but Ethan responded immediately. "I understand enough to know what unauthorized access looks like." And this time Olivia snapped, her voice rising. "You do not know anything about what I have done for this family." And that was the first time she stopped sounding controlled at all. Robert finally stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "Olivia, just answer the question." And that sentence alone seemed to fracture whatever balance she was holding on to. She turned toward him sharply. "You are going to believe him over me, after everything I have done," she said, and for the first time her words were not strategic. They were emotional, raw, and exposed. I felt something shift in me then, not anger, not revenge, but clarity, because I realized this was no longer about proving wrongdoing. It was about truth becoming unavoidable. I closed the folder gently and said, "I am not accusing anyone, I am reading what is documented." And that simple distinction made the room fall even quieter, because it removed emotion from the equation entirely. Olivia looked at me as if she was trying to find the old version of me that she could control, the version that hesitated, that doubted, that deferred. But I did not look away. Ethan finally spoke again, not to Olivia, but to everyone. "This is why I told you not to eat anything before we understood what was happening," he said, and then added, "because this did not start tonight. It started when access changed hands without full transparency." Margaret slowly sat back down, as if her body had finally given up trying to keep up with the conversation. Robert looked at the table, then at Olivia, and I could see something in him breaking quietly, not betrayal but realization. Olivia stepped back one step, then another, and for the first time she did not speak immediately, because there was nothing left to redirect, nothing left to soften, and in that silence I understood something very clearly. This was no longer a family argument. It was a record being opened, and once opened, it could not be closed again the same way. Colonel Halston looked at me one more time and said calmly, "At this point, Emily, the next step is yours, not theirs." And every person in the room turned slightly toward me again. Because whatever came next would no longer be interpretation, it would be consequence. The room no longer felt like it was holding a conversation. It felt like it was holding a fracture that had finally become visible, and I could see it in the way no one was looking at each other directly anymore. Olivia stood near the edge of the dining table, her arms crossed tightly now, not in confidence, but in containment, like she was trying to keep something inside herself from spilling out. Robert was the first to break the silence, his voice low and confused. "Olivia, just tell me what is going on." And that question alone seemed to destabilize everything she had been holding together, because it did not accuse her. It asked her to explain something she no longer fully controlled. Margaret looked between them, her hands folded tightly in her lap, whispering, "This cannot be real." But even she did not sound certain anymore. Ethan remained still, not advancing the situation, not escalating it, only watching. Like a man who had already seen this collapse coming long before it arrived, Colonel Halston stepped slightly back, giving space, not interference, and in that space, everything began to shift. Olivia suddenly turned toward Robert, her voice sharp again but fractured. "You think I did something wrong, after everything I have handled for this family," she said, and Robert responded immediately, not loudly, but firmly. "I think I do not understand what you have been handling," and that was the first direct separation, not from truth, but from loyalty. Olivia's eyes widened slightly, and she turned toward Margaret next. "You too, you are going to sit there and question me," she said, and Margaret flinched slightly, not because of fear, but because she had never been spoken to like that by her daughter before. Ethan finally spoke again, quietly. "This is what happens when systems built in silence get exposed," and Olivia snapped her head toward him. "Do not talk like you are above this," she said, but her voice was no longer stable. It was cracking at the edges, and I realized something strange. I had not spoken in several minutes, and yet I was no longer invisible in this room. I was the reference point everything was breaking around. Robert stepped closer to the table and pointed at the documents. "Olivia, these signatures, explain them," he said, and that was the moment she lost her patience completely. "I do not have to explain anything to you," she said, her voice rising, and then immediately falling again into something more desperate. "You were never interested in understanding how much I have done," she added, but instead of calming the room, it widened the gap between them. Because now it was not about truth versus lies, it was about perception versus reality, and they were no longer aligned on either, Colonel Halston observed quietly, then said, "When documentation contradicts explanation, institutions default to records." And that sentence landed heavier than any accusation, because it removed emotion entirely from the equation. Olivia turned toward him immediately. "You are not part of this family," she said sharply. And he replied calmly, "That is correct, which is why I am not emotionally invested in interpretation." And that distinction made her pause for a fraction of a second. Ethan leaned forward slightly and added, "You are not being accused in a vacuum, Olivia. You are being measured against records you helped create access to." And for the first time, I saw something happen that I had not expected. Olivia looked toward Ethan not with anger, but with disbelief, as if she was finally realizing that he was not improvising. He was informed. Robert suddenly stepped back from the table, as if something had physically shifted under him, and he said quietly, "So, this is real." Not a question anymore, a realization. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I do not understand how this got so far," she whispered, and that whisper seemed to break whatever illusion of unity had still existed in the room. Olivia turned again, but now there was no direction left in her argument, only fragments. "You are all twisting this. You are all misunderstanding intent," she said, but no one responded immediately, because intent no longer mattered in the same way. Ethan finally spoke again, and this time his voice was softer, almost tired. "Intent does not override access logs." And that was when Olivia's composure finally collapsed into something more visible. She placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, and said, "Fine. Yes, I helped manage things, because no one else was paying attention." The admission came out faster than she intended, and the moment it did, Robert stepped back again, not physically away from her, but emotionally, and said quietly, "You never told me that." Olivia turned toward him immediately. "Because you would not have understood," she said, and that sentence changed everything. because it was no longer denial, it was justification. Ethan looked down at the table briefly, then said, "That is how overreach always starts. Someone believes they are the only one capable of managing order." And Olivia reacted instantly. "I was protecting this family," she said, louder now, but her voice no longer carried certainty, only urgency, and Colonel Halston finally spoke again. "Protection without authorization is still deviation from protocol," and that line seemed to strip the last layer of structure she had left. Olivia looked around the room now, and for the first time she was not addressing individuals, she was addressing distance itself. "So what now, you all just turn against me because of papers," she said. But no one answered quickly enough, because the truth was already doing its work without help. Robert finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "No, Olivia, we are trying to understand what we were never told," and that distinction mattered more than anything else said that night, because it was not rejection, it was recognition of missing truth. Ethan looked at me then, not for approval, not for guidance, but as if confirming that I was still grounded in myself, and I realized something in that moment. I was not the trigger of this collapse, I was simply the point at which it could no longer stay hidden. Olivia stepped away from the table completely now, and said quietly, almost to herself, "This was supposed to be controlled," and that sentence revealed more than anything else had, because control was the only language left she still believed in, but the room no longer spoke it, and as silence settled again, it was clear that nothing in this family would return to the shape it had before, because what had once been hidden was no longer asking to be believed, it was already being recorded in real time. The room no longer felt like it was holding a confrontation, it felt like it was holding the aftermath of something that could not be reversed. Silence had replaced argument, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing more needed to be said in order to understand that the structure of this family had already shifted beyond repair. Olivia stood away from the table now, her arms no longer crossed, her posture no longer controlled, just still, as if movement itself required a version of certainty she no longer had. Robert remained near the table but no longer leaning into it. Margaret sat with her hands folded tightly, looking down at her lap as if searching for something stable there. Ethan finally relaxed slightly in his chair, not in victory but in exhaustion, the kind that comes after holding something in place for too long. Colonel Halston closed his folder with a quiet finality, not dramatic, just definitive, and said, "At this stage the record speaks for itself, further dispute will move outside this room." And somehow that sentence felt like the end of something larger than tonight. I looked around the room slowly, and I realized no one was looking for blame anymore, they were looking for meaning. And there is a difference between the two that changes everything about how a person breathes in a moment like this. Olivia finally spoke again, but her voice was no longer sharp, it was quiet, almost uncertain. "So what happens now?" she asked, not to anyone in particular, but to the space itself. Ethan answered softly, "Now we stop pretending this was normal," and there was no anger in his voice, only release. Robert exhaled slowly and said, "I need to understand how I never saw this." And for the first time, that question sounded less like guilt and more like regret. Margaret stood slowly, as if her body was no longer interested in participating in the conversation, and she said quietly, "I think I need to sit down somewhere else," before walking out of the room, not leaving the situation but leaving the intensity of it, and no one stopped her, because everyone understood that sometimes distance is the only way people survive truth. Olivia looked at her mother walking away, and something in her expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but awareness that consequences were no longer theoretical, they were already happening. Ethan finally turned to me more fully, and for the first time all night his voice carried something lighter. "You do not have to carry this part anymore," he said, and I realized he was not talking about documents or records. He was talking about the weight that had been sitting inside me long before this dinner began. I did not respond immediately, because I was still listening to my own thoughts settle, like dust after something has fallen. Colonel Halston stepped back toward the hallway and said calmly, "My role here is complete unless further legal clarification is requested." And then he paused briefly, looking at me directly. "But I will say this. Sometimes truth is not about winning, it is about restoring visibility." And then he left, and his absence made the room feel larger and emptier at the same time. Olivia slowly sat back down at the edge of her chair, not fully collapsing, not fully composed, just suspended between versions of herself, and she said quietly, "I did not think it would become this." And for the first time she was not defending, she was revealing fatigue. Robert looked at her and said, "None of us thought anything like this existed." And that sentence was the closest thing to unity left in the room. Ethan reached for my hand gently, not to guide me, not to direct me, but simply to anchor me. And I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with documents or explanations. I felt the absence of tension I had carried for so long that I had mistaken it for normal life. I looked at Olivia then, really looked, and I did not feel anger anymore, not even confusion, only distance, the kind that comes when a story you have been living inside finally stops being the only version available. And I said softly, more to myself than anyone else, "I do not want to live inside this version of family anymore." And no one argued with me, because there was nothing left in that moment worth defending, only what came after. Ethan nodded slightly, as if he understood exactly what I meant, and for the first time since this night began, I thought about something other than what had been hidden. I thought about what could exist after it, not justice, not resolution, but something quieter, something that did not require constant interpretation. And as I sat there in that house in Richmond, Virginia, I understood that leaving a battlefield is not the same as losing it. Sometimes it is the first time you finally choose where peace begins, even if everyone else is still learning how to stand in the silence it leaves behind. The house in Richmond, Virginia felt different the next morning, not because anything had physically changed, but because everything that once felt hidden now felt visible, like the air itself had finally stopped pretending. Sunlight came through the kitchen window in a soft, ordinary way, falling across the same dining table where everything had collapsed the night before. But now there was no tension sitting on the chairs, only absence. Ethan was the first to break the silence, sitting at the edge of the living room with a quiet steadiness I had not seen in him before, not the alertness of suspicion, but the calm of someone who no longer needed to brace himself. "It is strange," he said softly, "how quiet things become when you stop pretending they are normal." I did not answer immediately because I was still learning what quiet meant when it was not filled with uncertainty. Olivia was not in the house. She had left before sunrise, and no one had stopped her. Robert sat near the window, holding a coffee cup that had long gone cold, staring at nothing specific, as if trying to understand how a lifetime of assumptions could change in a single night. Margaret returned briefly that morning, not with explanations, but with a silence that felt heavier than words. She placed a small envelope on the counter, looked at me for a long moment, and simply said, "I did not know how much I was not seeing," before leaving again. And that sentence stayed in the room longer than she did. Colonel Halston had already departed, leaving behind only structured clarity and official documentation that now felt less like evidence and more like history being corrected in real time. Ethan and I sat together in the quiet after everyone had gone, and for the first time in a long time there was no need to interpret anyone else's emotions in order to survive the moment. He finally spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You do not have to rebuild what was never balanced to begin with," and I understood what he meant, not as advice but as permission. Robert eventually came back into the room, slower this time, as if each step required reconsideration, and he sat across from us without the authority he once carried so naturally. "I keep thinking about how long I accepted things without asking the right questions," he said quietly, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for correction, just acknowledging distance from his own awareness. I looked at him and realized something important. Anger had never been the final emotion of this story. Clarity was, and clarity does not demand destruction. It demands truth being allowed to remain unhidden. I said softly, "None of us were given the full picture. That is what I keep coming back to." And in saying that I felt something release inside me, not closure, but weight redistribution. Ethan reached for my hand again, not as protection, but as companionship. And for the first time I felt like I was not being defined by what had happened, but by what I chose to do after understanding it. Days passed, then weeks, and life did not return to what it was before. It became something quieter, more deliberate. Olivia did not reappear in the same way she had before. Her presence in the family became distant, reduced to brief messages that carried no performance, only distance. Robert began taking responsibility for understanding what had been overlooked, not to repair the past, but to ensure the future was not built on the same blind spots. Margaret reached out less, but when she did, her words were simpler, more honest, and less shaped by roles she had once tried to maintain. And Ethan, for the first time since I had known him, no longer carried the weight of being the only one alert in a room full of assumptions. One evening, sitting outside on the porch as the Virginia air cooled into something soft and steady, I finally spoke not as someone recounting a fracture, but as someone recognizing survival. "I used to think family meant endurance," I said quietly. "Now I understand it has to also mean recognition, respect, and the freedom to step back when something no longer holds you correctly." Ethan nodded beside me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left that needed immediate explanation, only presence. And I want to say this to anyone listening, not as instruction, but as something I learned slowly. Sometimes the people closest to you will not see you clearly, not because you are invisible, but because they are used to seeing you through a version of you that no longer exists, and there comes a point where your responsibility is not to correct their vision, but to protect your own truth. If you are still in the middle of confusion like I was, I want you to know that clarity does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, after everything falls apart enough to stop pretending, and when it does not ask you to fight, it asks you to see, and that is where everything begins again. I want to thank you for being here and listening, not just to the events but to the silence between them, because that is where understanding often lives. And if you take anything from this, let it be this: your life does not have to be defined by the roles others assign you. It can be rebuilt around the truth you finally choose to acknowledge. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something unspoken in your own life, I would gently invite you to like and subscribe. And if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts below, not because you need to explain anything, but because being heard matters more than being understood perfectly. The lesson I carry from all of this is simple. Self-respect is not something you negotiate, it is something you protect, and when you do, everything else eventually finds its true place. There are more stories waiting here, stories about family, truth, silence, and the moments that change everything without warning, and I hope you will join me for them, not because they are easy, but because they remind us we are not alone in what we carry. Thank you for listening to this story.